7 Radeon 7. This GPU is dying, so I'm gonna make a video on it. Why not?
Today, I'm really happy to show you for the very first time our new high-end GPU for gamers and creators, AMD Radeon 7.
The Radeon 7 was a GPU released by AMD in February of 2019. It features 3,840 shading units, 240 TMUs, 64 ROPs, and 60 compute units. It features a base clock of 1400 MHz with a peak clock of 1802 and a memory clock of 1000 MHz. All of this on the 7nm process with a massive 4096-bit bus thanks to its 16GB of HBM2. The Radeon 7 offered good improvement in production applications over the previous generation. It was marketed for gaming, however, its feature set made it better for production more than anything. Still, at 4K, its performance rivaled the RTX 2080. At 4K only though, because at low resolutions it would not keep up with it. I definitely overpaid for this GPU, buying it last year for a price of $400. But I think it was worth it, as it was a GPU I've always wanted to add to my collection, as it's one of my favorites. With all that aside, let's figure out how this GPU stacks up to today's games. The system I'm going to use for benchmarking has a Ryzen Threadripper Pro 5955WX, 128GB of 3200 MHz CL16 RAM, all on top of a 1000 watt PSU, with 2TB of Gen 4 NVMe storage for the games. Results for normal Forza Horizon 5 gameplay things were pretty good, with 98 FPS on average and 1% lows at 1080p, 76 FPS on average with 1% lows at 1440p, and 52 FPS on average with 26 FPS 1% lows at 4K. Now for Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, where I only got benchmark gameplay, as it kept crashing during normal gameplay, which will be a theme of this card, because it's dying. It got 93 FPS on average at 66 1% lows at 1080p high, 69 FPS on average with 44 1% lows at 1440p high, and at 4K high it got 41 FPS on average with 25 1% lows. Not that bad, but definitely not the greatest for this card. Now for The Last of Us. It ran pretty good, with 71 FPS on average and 1% lows of 41 on 1080p medium, 51 FPS on average with 1% lows of 27 at 1440p, and finally 31 FPS on average with 1% lows of 16, which was a very cinematic experience since it mostly stood around 25 FPS. Now for Spider-Man Remastered, which is a pretty well optimized game, so it ran pretty well throughout the whole thing, with 74 FPS on average and 1% lows of 48 at 1080p high, 66 FPS on average with 1% lows of 40 at 1440p high, and finally 42 FPS on average with 1% lows of 25 at 4K high. So pretty good. Even if the 4K results are a bit low, you could just use FSR to bring it up to around 60. Next is Red Dead Redemption 2, which is a pretty time period accurate game for this card, and its results were 97 FPS on average with 1% lows of 64 on 1080p high, 76 FPS on average with 1% lows of 58 at 1440p high, and finally 48 FPS on average with 1% lows of 37 at 4K high. Pretty decent, and I kind of expected since the card is from the same time period as this game. Next up is Cyberpunk 2077, which ran worse than I expected, with 45 FPS on average and 1% lows of 40 at 1080p medium, 37 FPS on average with 1% lows of 29 at 1440p, and finally 23 FPS on average, 1% low to 18 at 4K. This is much worse than when I last ran this game, but it could be because of all the patches that have been applied to it now. Now for the final game I'm testing, Starfield. At 4K medium with 50% res scaling, the average was 39 FPS, with 1% low to 24. Then at 75% res scaling, the average was 30 FPS with 1% low to 17. And then finally, at 4K with 100% res scaling, the average was 30 FPS with 1% low to 19. Oddly enough here, the 1% loads are higher than the 75% res scale, which is weird. But the FPS still wasn't great. Definitely probably would apply FSR here if you actually are going to use this card to play Starfield. Or just bump down the native resolution. I could do that as then it would open into window mode. Now for synthetic benchmarks. First starting with Time Spy, where it got 9,368 on the graphics score, which leads it to a 9,845 total score. This places the system as better than 58% of all results for Time Spy on 3Mark's website. Now for Cinebench 2024, where on the GPU side, it got a score of 3,432 points. This puts it ahead of the Radeon Pro 5500M by a significant amount, and behind the Apple M1 Max by a significant amount. I was going to include the Blender benchmark, however it crashed every single time I tried to launch it, and now that brings us on to our major issue with this card. When I say this card is dying, I mean it's dying. It crashes randomly in games, it crashes in applications, it lags, there is something majorly wrong with it, and I have no clue what it is. However, to my knowledge, this is a pretty common issue with Radeon 7s, with code 43 being the most common, because of a supposed issue that would separate the GPU package from the PCB, causing that error. Mine still works, however, so I decided to no overclock anything to it as to not accelerate its death. So that is the end of the video. What are my thoughts on this card exactly? Well, it's way too expensive normally to buy, so don't buy it used. However, if you can get a good deal on it, maybe around like $200, $150, then I'd say go for it, since it has similar performance to a RX 5700 XT, just with twice the VRAM. Now, for memory bandwidth heavy applications, I don't know, as I don't have any. But if that suits your needs, I would say then you could also go for it, but there might be better options out there. I don't know. Also should mention this GPU is pretty small for what it is. Compared to my 7900 XTX, it is tiny and takes up only 2 slots, which is actually pretty cool, and I kind of like that. So that's the end of the video. If you like this review, please like and subscribe, and I will post another one day again. Bye.